Well, it certainly was a surprise, I think, to see the size of the jump here, as much as 42% in the beginning of trading. But as you say, really, this is a penny stock. So the bulk of this very likely to be driven around the sort of speculative bets that you would see around a penny stock. And the other thing to note, really, is that since its high in 2017, Evergrande stock has already fallen by 99%. So it is a very different ball game here.
Indeed. So, you know, they're back trading. They say they've revealed as much as there is to reveal about the company. Is that the sense of traders, that the worst is known about Evergrande and the challenges it faces?
I think there certainly is a lot of uncertainty among investors still, and that's really around two major points. The first is the nature of the probe into Evergrande. So we know that Hui Ka Yan, the founder of Evergrande, was placed under police control. Separately, there have been reports of a wider investigation into Evergrande's health management unit. We know that police have also probed Evergrande's former CFO and former CEO. So there's this other unknown element, which is we've moved into a different phase of the crisis at Evergrande, one that is focused on criminality and criminal investigation, but it's really unclear the direction of travel. The other element is, you know, the big question mark over where this leaves investors who are involved in the restructuring. Now, Evergrande overall has more than $320 billion in liabilities. A significant chunk of that is trying to be worked out, particularly with these offshore bondholders who are trying to figure out some kind of deal, how they're going to be made whole. Of course, not fully whole, but made partially whole in some way. Now, that has essentially sort of stalled, and those investors are still in limbo.
So tell us a little bit more about the founder and what they are investigating him over.
We don't have a great deal of detail about that, but Hui Ka Yan has been placed under police control, and it's sort of so-called residential surveillance. It falls short of a formal arrest or a formal detention, but clearly does fit in with this broader theme that we've seen, looking into and thinking about accountability, this next stage of what's happened at Evergrande. Now, Evergrande, for this sort of the story of Evergrande for the last decade, has been coming to the edge of these sort of financial crisis, but always being able to solve itself. It's sort of something of the bad boy of property, if you can say. It always had been dallying with this sort of slightly what the PBOC and authorities have called reckless expansion and reckless borrowing based on huge amounts of debt. So that in some ways has always been known about the nature of the company. Now, the Wall Street Journal has also reported that the actions now being taken on Hui Ka Yan are linked to him potentially trying to transfer offshore assets, so assets to transfer offshore during this period where Evergrande is still just struggling to, for example, complete unfinished properties.
Yes. And so that's, again, another part of this puzzle, that they may be trying to restructure debt and get the company on some sort of sound footing. But the property sector in China is still really struggling to find confidence.
I think that's the really critical issue here for China. Now, the issues at Evergrande, you have to remember, the firm first defaulted on its debt late in 2021. Those issues are widely understood and widely known by investors, even though, of course, it is such a major player. The bigger issue for Beijing is the difficulties that we are seeing in the property sector, the inability to really get this sector back up and running. And if you just look at last month's figures, the value of new home sales in September fell by nearly 30% year over year. So we can really see that struggling sort of policymakers, despite the raft of supportive measures that they've pulled out, are struggling to turn around sentiment. And it is that confidence issue which is crucial, because so long as property prices are falling, people just don't feel richer. And so they aren't inclined to go out and spend. Now, we are in this quite critical period of Golden Week holidays in China. So those are going on through this week. And it's quite an important period for spending in China. Economists will be watching this very, very closely to see whether the Chinese consumer is back out, whether they're traveling, whether they're buying goods. But the property component is a big part of that, because this should be seasonally a busy period for buying homes.
Yes. So I can imagine that other property companies are impacted as well. Do you think the government's going to step in to prop up a company like Evergrande, or could it ultimately just go bankrupt?
Well, what has been really interesting about this sort of managed crisis and this managed slowdown of the property sector, which is important to remember, Beijing itself rolled out these restrictions, is that so far policymakers have been quite muted, quite hesitant to step in and offer any kind of wholesale support or offer support to individual companies to prevent them, for example, defaulting. I think there seems to be so far a preference to let the sort of market work this out. The goal, of course, here is at the end, you will have these big players, these likely to be state players that are the survivors, that take on the sort of smaller projects from private companies. The difficulty is that now even some of these state players are running into trouble, for example, warning of profit losses and so on. So that's where the sort of playbook here becomes a little bit uncertain. But Beijing's determination through all of this has been to move away from its addiction to debt that's fueled so much of its growth and fueled this property boom for so many years in China. It's unlikely that we see Beijing sort of stepping in to reverse that, no matter, after so many months of pain.
Yeah, lots to play out yet. Great to talk, Rebecca. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.